The rain had already soaked through Elias's jacket by the time he reached the old pine gate. Mud clung to his boots, and the wind turned his breath into clouds as he cradled a tin-wrapped piem to his chest like something breakable. The pie was still warm, barely made from scratch at dawn in his Manhattan apartment, filled with cinnamon and too much hope. Elias had driven all night through storms and roadblocks, gripping the wheel harder with each passing town, telling himself this time would be different. His father was turning 70. If there was ever a moment to try again, it was now. He hadn't been back in years. Not really, not since coming out. There were occasional video calls that ended too quickly, Christmas cards with no return address, and polite silences that always felt a breath away from rejection. But money flowed without interruption. Elias had paid for a new roof after the hurricane, sent checks for grandma's treatments, and even helped his younger brother buy a second-hand pickup. They never asked twice, never said thank you either, but Elias convinced himself love didn't always come in words. The porch light was off, but voices carried from the back patio, loud enough to stop him mid-step. He wasn't supposed to hear them. He knew that from the way they spoke, unguarded, unkind, unaware of the man shivering in the driveway holding dessert. You really think he'd keep sending money if he knew we never accepted that lifestyle? The voice was his father's, familiar and cutting in its casual cruelty. His brother chuckled. He still thinks he's the good son. Let him believe it, at least until we finish paying off that vacation house. Elias didn't move. The pie pressed against his ribs. His throat felt full of gravel. For a second, he wondered if they were talking about someone else. But the weight in his chest said otherwise. They had never really seen him. They'd only seen the bank transfers and the convenient silence. He stepped back without a sound, turned toward the car, and left the pie on the porch table. No one saw him come. No one would see him leave. There would be birthday candles, laughter, maybe even a toast. All without the son who had driven through thunder to stand outside his own family's warmth. As the rain thickened into sheets, Elias pulled onto the empty road. The wipers scraped at the windshield like claws. Every mile that took him away from that house also took away something else. An illusion, a hope, a lie he'd fed himself too long. They didn't forget to love him. They chose not to. And Elias, finally, was done pretending otherwise. If this story touched something in you, don't scroll away. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more true stories of love, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to start again. Your story matters, too. Back in New York, the city lights didn't feel quite as forgiving. Elias stepped inside his apartment, pieless and wordless, and dropped his damp coat onto the floor. The radiator hummed faintly in the corner, but the cold had settled somewhere deeper, untouched by steam or blankets. He didn't cry, not at first, not when the door closed behind him. Not even when he noticed the thank you card he'd bought weeks ago still sitting on the entry table, unsigned, waiting to be delivered with the pie. Instead, he just stood there, blinking at nothing, while the quiet pressed against his ears like a tide. The next morning, Elias went back to writing as if nothing had happened. He sat at his desk, opened his manuscript, and stared at the cursor blinking on an unfinished paragraph. Words used to come easily. Not today. Not after hearing the truth laid bare like that. It wasn't just what they said. It was how easily they said it, like a joke they'd told before, like something rehearsed. He made coffee, burned toast, checked his inbox, everything routine. But inside, something had split open. Quietly, he started replaying memories not as comfort, but as evidence. A trial unfolding in his head. He remembered the family barbecue where he was told not to mention anything political when his boyfriend visited. The way his mother smiled too tightly when he brought vegan snacks, then threw them out. The group photo at his cousin's wedding where he was asked to step aside just for the family picture. They hadn't accepted him gradually. They had erased him incrementally. Every time they skipped over his name in toasts. Every time they forwarded invites only to his brother. Every holiday rescheduled last minute, that always ended up being posted on Facebook the next day? Elias had chalked it up to miscommunication, busyness, bad timing, but now he knew better. They didn't forget him. They excluded him, and worse, they did it with intent dressed in politeness. He thought of the pie again, sitting out on that porch, cooling into nothing. That pie had more sincerity in it than any of their phone calls. It had been made with hands that believed love could be returned if offered sweetly enough. He'd been wrong. By the end of the week, Elias had deleted their group chat, unfollowed family accounts, turned off notifications. No message came looking for him, not even to ask why he hadn't stayed, not even to say goodbye. Sometimes abandonment doesn't come in one clean cut. It comes in layers. It comes in silence. And Elias was finally listening. One quiet Thursday morning, Elias sat at his kitchen counter with a bowl of cereal turning soggy and untouched. His laptop glowed dimly in front of him, the screen filled with spreadsheets and statements from a financial advisor he hadn't spoken to in over a year. What began as a restless impulse, a need to sort things out, had turned into something else, something colder, something revealing. He hadn't wanted to dig. He told himself it wasn't worth the emotional labor, that he was just updating some files for tax season. But curiosity has a way of finding rot when given the light. The first red flag was a real estate transaction, a 6-bedroom vacation home on Lake Oconee. The purchase had been made under a trust account Elias didn't recall authorizing, yet his name sat plainly on the legal documents. Mortgage co-signed by him. Approval given via a power of attorney agreement he had signed long ago, handed to his father at a family reunion with little thought. Just something to make it easier for taxes, they'd said. A quick favor for people he thought still saw him as family. The second discovery hit harder. 3 credit cards, all opened under his name, all with mailing addresses routed through his parents' home. Thousands in expenses, car repairs, flights to Miami, luxury rental receipts, and even college textbooks, none of which were his. His brother's name popped up on a transaction for an online course. Elias remembered now, an excited phone call months ago. "Hey, could I use your info to apply? My credit's still shot, but I'll pay you back right away." He never paid him back. He never intended to. Elias leaned back in his chair, the ceiling above him suddenly feeling too low. His heart didn't race. No panic attack came. What filled him was something quieter, heavier, a kind of grief that didn't cry, it just settled, like dust in an abandoned room. He had built an imagined version of his family in his mind, a version where they didn't know how to show love, but tried, a version where silence meant uncertainty, not rejection. But the documents in front of him, they weren't miscommunications. They weren't mistakes. They were a pattern, calculated, practical, cruel. He searched his email history, found old attachments, scanned PDFs labeled authorization forms and family trust revisions. And then it hit him. He had signed all of them, eager to be helpful, grateful to still be included, desperate not to be a disappointment. Love had made him gullible. Or maybe it wasn't love at all, just a hunger for belonging, twisted into obedience. He called his lawyer, booked an appointment, didn't tell anyone. That night, he walked past his bookshelf and paused at a framed photo of him and his father, taken on the porch steps back when Elias was still in high school, back when he still thought the man beside him would cheer for whoever he became. He didn't smash the frame, he didn't burn it, he simply turned it face down. The next morning, he drafted a letter to the financial institutions, legal withdrawal of authorization, request for forensic audits, formal disputes of charges. No anger in the tone, just clarity. Elias had spent years thinking his queerness made him the disappointment, the weak link, the outsider. But now he saw the truth. He was the most useful, the most giving, the most silent. And they had counted on that silence. Not anymore. He wasn't just walking away from their house. He was pulling every root they had ever wrapped around his name. And this time they would feel the absence. The documents went out in batches, each one signed with a steady hand. sealed in envelopes Elias never thought he'd address. His lawyer reviewed every page twice, occasionally pausing to glance at him with quiet admiration, not for the complexity of the paperwork, but for the decision itself. People didn't usually pull the plug on their own family, not unless something had broken beyond repair. But Elias wasn't acting from rage, he was acting from clarity. He terminated all co-signed agreements, revoked the dormant power of attorney, filed a formal notice with the trust overseeing the Lake Oconee property, making it clear that he no longer consented to any financial activity bearing his name. It was surgical, each step precise, each form an unraveling of the rope they had looped around him for years. He also changed his will. The original version, written in a softer season of hope, had named his father and brother as partial heirs, along with a modest fund for his niece when she turned 18. He had written it with generosity, believing that team and love could soften even the hardest divides. Now every line had been rewritten. His new beneficiaries were a nonprofit in Vermont dedicated to housing and healthcare for LGBTQ+ elders, many of whom, like Elias, had spent too long trying to earn a love that should have been freely given. He attached a letter, not out of pettiness, not as revenge, but because silence, he realized, had never protected him. It had only protected them. You raised me to believe love required sacrifice, that I had to prove myself worthy of inclusion, that the right amount of success, of help, of humility might buy your respect. I now see it never would have. What you loved was the version of me that paid your bills and asked for nothing. That version is gone. From now on, I choose to give where it won't cost my dignity. Don't contact me to negotiate. Don't apologize because you've been found out. I'm not angry anymore, just done. The letter didn't tremble. It didn't beg. It landed like a gavel. Elias didn't send it by email. He printed 3 copies, one to his lawyer's office, one to be attached to the revised will, and one delivered by registered mail to his father's home, the same porch where he had left the pie. He wondered if they ever ate it. Later that week, Elias logged out of all his social accounts, deleted family photos from his phone, not out of hatred, but to make space for the life that came next. He spent his afternoons walking through Central Park, letting the sounds of the city remind him that solitude wasn't the same as loneliness. He cooked for himself without imagining someone else at the table. He began outlining a new book, not a novel this time, but essays, fragments of things he had once silenced, pages filled with questions he was finally willing to ask. What happens when love turns into leverage? Why do we stay where we are, only barely tolerated? How long can a lie live before it starts calling itself kindness? He didn't have all the answers, but he had his own voice back. That was enough to begin. He didn't expect a reply from his family, but they sent one anyway. A voicemail, his father's voice, brittle and bruised. I don't understand where all this anger is coming from. We never meant to hurt you. You always took things too personally. Elias didn't respond, because for the first time, he wasn't looking for closure. He had created it. Elias moved to Vermont quietly, without ceremony. No going away party, no social media announcement, just a one-way ticket, 2 suitcases, and a contract to volunteer part-time at a nonprofit residence for elderly LGBTQ+ individuals. It was a small house with soft lighting and mismatched furniture. The walls were lined with portraits, some framed, some taped with care of residents in their youth, all eyes bright with the kind of hope that never made the headlines. It was not glamorous, but it was safe, and it was honest. Elias found peace in the simple things, reading medical waivers to those who no longer trusted systems, writing living wills for elders with no children, recording life stories for those whose past had been wiped by time or shame. Each person he met carried decades of silence, grief, resilience, and somehow, through helping them sort the chaos of their histories, Elias began to understand his own. One afternoon, he sat beside a man named Robert, whose husband had died during the AIDS crisis. They never married, never even shared a lease, just lived side by side for 22 years until the hospital refused to let Robert in during the final days. Elias listened quietly as the man wept, not from sorrow, but from relief that someone finally cared to hear it. I didn't know what it meant to belong, Elias said once, pouring tea for a resident with shaky hands, until I stopped trying to earn it. The house became a kind of church, a chapel without judgment, in its warmth. Elias wrote again. He filled notebook after notebook, not about his family, but about chosen family, about people who remembered birthdays because they wanted to, who offered their last blanket without asking where you'd been, who saw love not as a transaction, but as a reason to stay. Months passed, then one day a letter arrived. It was from his brother, postmarked from Georgia. The handwriting was clumsy, unfamiliar, like someone writing through guilt. Inside was a single sentence. My daughter asked why Uncle Elias never comes home for the holidays. And I didn't know what to tell her, though. Elias read the line once, then again. He didn't feel rage. He didn't feel victory, just a deep, wordless ache. The kind that comes from realizing someone finally noticed you were gone, not because they missed you, but because someone else started asking why. He didn't write back, but he didn't tear the letter either. He placed it between the pages of his latest manuscript, right after a chapter called The Cost of Being Useful. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like a period at the end of a long, unraveling sentence. That night, Elias went outside. The Vermont air was crisp, and snow whispered against the pavement. Through the windows of the center, he could see a group of residents watching an old movie, heads tilted, laughter rising in imperfect harmony. He wasn't home because of blood. He was home because he no longer had to apologize for being there. He had given up the family that only valued his silence for a community that honored his voice. And now, for you reading this, have you ever had to walk away from the people who raised you just to find the ones who'd really stand by you? What does home mean to you now? Share your story into the comments. Someone out there needs to hear it. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe to Heart Stories, and turn on notifications, because here, every story matters, especially yours.